The modern Rangers were established during World War II and led America's fight in Europe, leading assaults in North Africa and spearheading the liberation of Sicily. The Ranger regiments in the Army today owe their legacy to these Rangers of World War II, nicknamed Darby's Rangers. How and why were the Rangers formed? What was their role in the Dieppe raid? What happened at the devastating event in Cisterna, Italy? And how did the Rangers frustrate the Germans, even in captivity? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the famed 1st Rangers of World War II, called Darby's Rangers. And joining me for this discussion is historian and former Army Ranger, Mir Bahmanyar. Welcome, Mir.
Hey, thank you very much, Lee, for having me, and thanks to all the listeners who are going to join us.
Well, thanks, Mir, and I hope I did not mess up your name, but you know,
as long as the first name is
Mir,
the first name is good, we're good to go. So.
That's too easy. So let me just introduce you to the listeners. Let them know who you are. So Mir Bahmanyar received a bachelor's degree in history from UC Berkeley. Then he enlisted in the 2nd Battalion of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and later earned a master's degree in war studies from King's College London. His jobs, and he's got some interesting jobs here, have included library clerk, janitor, bookstore owner, security services, military technical advisor, German language coach, and producer and writer in Hollywood. He is an author of many books focused on military history, including his new release called The Houdini Club, about Darby's Rangers. Mir brings a unique perspective to military history, having lived in 4 countries across 3 continents, and he also writes thrillers. Well, that's a pretty fascinating bio. But one of the other things Mir, that I think adds to your credibility on this subject is that you've been in touch with these Darby's Rangers for years, and you've gotten to personally know many of them. Can you talk a little bit about your association with them?
Sure. As you rightly stated, I joined the 2nd Ranger Battalion. That's long before some people were born in the 80s. And oddly enough, I received a medical discharge out of a program from ROTC. I'd gone from 2nd Battalion to the Reserve Officer Training Corps Green to Gold program. Mm-hmm. I got medically discharged, but I stayed active within the 75th Ranger Regiment Association, things like that. And I've gone to reunions. And then ultimately I moved to LA. And back in those days, we had bulletin boards, online mm-hmm. bulletin boards, and we still used to write letters. So on occasion, I'd reach out to old World War II guys like Merrill's Marauders or something.
Oh, wow.
And I'd send them a letter and ask them some questions. They'd send them back to me. And then I moved to LA because I wanted to be in Hollywood. And one of the Rangers there said, hey, there's this old timer. He lives in LA and he's got hundreds of photos of Rangers. Mm. So I'm living in Los Angeles. I call this guy up and his name is Phil Stern. Mm. Phil is actually the guy who sent me along this path of Darby's Rangers. Oh. So Phil was a very, very famous Hollywood photographer. He was buddies with Jimmy Dean.
Oh, wow.
He knew Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, people like that. And he had almost killed James Dean when he ran his motorcycle through an intersection and fell almost in with his car. So that's how they became friends. But Phil had enlisted during the Second World War. He didn't want to sit out the war. So he was assigned to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And he ended up with an assignment to join this new unit, Darby Rangers. And Phil had hundreds of pictures, and through Phil, I was introduced to a lot of the original Darby Rangers, or the ones who had survived in their old age. And I'd go to their World War II association meetings. Most of this was in LA. And I'd be talking to a lot of them, and then I'd call some guys that I was introduced to and send letters off to others. And, I maintained that sort of relationship on and off since I'd say early 90s, maybe. I started a little bit earlier, but I met Phil when I went down to LA in the early 90s. So I met a lot of guys, went to reunions, and stayed in touch with these guys. And that's how I became interested in Darby's Rangers. And, I was in the 2nd Ranger Battalion. You'd think normally I'd be interested in the 2nd Ranger Battalion.
Right.
But it didn't happen that way. And so over the years, I scanned in a lot of Phil Stern's World War II images of Darby's Rangers that he had taken, because I was one of the first guys to have a flatbed scanner, and I was all about preserving history. And so I did that, and I probably would visit Phil, I don't know, once every week, once every 2 weeks. We'd go out for lunch sometimes. And so anyway, it's through him that I started this whole Darby Ranger thing, and I accumulated a lot of stuff. And some of these old timers were beyond generous. I mean, there was a guy called Gino Mercuriali. He sent me like dozens of floppy disks, and when I started writing this new book on Darby's Rangers, I had to go buy a floppy disk thing because I couldn't. My old hard drive stopped working. So I had to go to this local store in Toronto to find an old floppy disk thing and plug it in. And but these guys were really great. And I never, technically speaking, I never interviewed anyone. I never sat down with a recorder and a pen and paper. I've always found that once you do that, I'm not saying that they acted, but the people you interview, and I've interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers, from basically World War II through, today's wars. So I've learned that sometimes it's just better to talk. Yeah. And these old timers were great. And once they knew I had served in the Ranger Battalion, it was completely different. It was like, all of a sudden they were very open, and they'd be saying, they'd be talking a lot of smack.
Well, you're one of them.
Some guys.
Right.
Exactly. So they were really great. And, you get like society itself, you get a diversity of guys to talk to. Some truly patriotic America can do no wrong. Two guys who are like, I wish I had never done this. It's the worst thing in my life. Right. But they would open up and be very frank about things. And of course, they've also filled out questionnaires, not just for me, but also for the U.S. Army. So, but that set me on the Darby's Rangers path, which is kind of my interest. I accumulated a lot of things, and some of them passed away. Jim Altieri, who had written a great book called Spearheaders. I'd met him many times. I'd written a small book, 64 pages on Darby's Rangers, and he loved it and made me an associate historian of the World War II Ranger Battalion Association. And eventually he passed, and one of his friends called me up. I was still living in LA at the time, and he told me he had boxes of Jim's stuff. So I drove down and got those things. So basically Jim's life is in my basement until a year or two ago when I started to dig things up again. And there are 2 unpublished books in there, which was interesting. And I also managed to get his original book, Spearheaders, republished by the U.S. Naval Institute Press. So I can say I spend a lot of time with some of them, a lot more time, and with others just a little bit.
Yeah, like a real passion project for you on this. And I did read through your new book, The Houdini Club, which is, I have to say, it's just a page turner. I found it hard to put down. And, based on all these firsthand accounts, you are unquestionably the right person to talk to about the creation of the Army Rangers, or Darby's Rangers, as they were called in World War II. So let's get to that beginning. Can you just describe for us how and when the Army Rangers were first formed in World War II, and talk a little bit about why was there a need for them and what was their mission?
This is actually a very interesting story, quite frankly. When you look at some of the records, you can tell that the United States was preparing for war, although Pearl Harbor hadn't happened, the attack in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in 1941, that hadn't happened yet. But you could tell the military was mobilizing, getting modern, getting modernized a little bit because, the dark clouds of war were hanging all over the world. So what happened is, war has started, we're like, I think early 1942 at this point, and the U.S. Military is sending American troops over to Northern Ireland, it's kind of like, this is where we're going to assemble, we're going to get organized, we're going to join the war effort. And what the decision was by Hire in order to modernize and in order to help the Green troops, the idea was to create some kind of unit along the lines of British commandos. British commandos had been raiding, German lines and probably Italian lines also at this time, behind enemy lines, conducting small raids, destroying things, that kind of stuff. And so the American hierarchy thought, hey, we should do something like that. We should have a commando-like unit. We train them, we send them off with these British commandos to gain some combat experience, and then we're going to take them back and send them back to all the units where they came from to spread the combat experience and their training. So it was a provisional unit at the beginning, and that was the idea. And it was based on British commandos. So it was never a permanent thing. It was going to be a small unit based on small British commandos. And the way the British commandos operated is they had small landing craft. So when we created the Rangers, we had them train up a little bit, and I'll get to that in a second. But it was a small unit. The Ranger battalions that we would see were very small because they're based on fitting onto these landing crafts. Whereas a regular World War II American company would be something like 200 guys, a Ranger company would be maybe 70, 75 with add-ons. So it's really small. So that's the thing to always remember. In any event, so the decision was made we needed troops like this. And we had a couple of officers, Conway and I forgot his name now. It'll come to me eventually. And Cheney. And they were attached to these British commandos, and they were organizing things. And they're like, well, we like the British organization, but we don't like the equipment they use. We want to keep our things American. So basically, instead of using a Bren gun, we would use, our own eventual Bar rifle, which is sort of like an automatic rifle. We would use American equipment. We would use Jeeps, things like that. So what they did is they called out for volunteers, and they needed, of course, a leader. And the guy called William Darby, who was a West Pointer, artillery guy, very experienced in artillery, had been on staff in Northern Ireland, and he had been pestering his superiors. And, of course, all this secret documentation is crossing his desk as a staff officer. And he's been pestering his hires to put him into some kind of tactical unit. Lucky for him, back then it was a colonel. He eventually becomes a general. Truscott, Lucian Truscott, is tasked with organizing this new British commando unit, the American version. And Darby accompanies him. And so Truscott goes around, meets people, looks at everything, and they decide, yes, we're going to go ahead and do this. And Darby finds out about this, tortures his superior officer, who then recommends Darby to Truscott. And Truscott goes, hey, yes, I remember him. He was great, very capable man, all that. So Darby then got the job, right time, right place, right guy. Got the job to organize this new unit.
And through his own insistence,
so Darby gets this job.
Right?
Yep, absolutely. It's very driven West Pointer, very, very much wanting to get into the war. He wasn't going to sit as a staff guy anywhere, right? And so he was given the job. He was promoted. He was a captain at the time. He was promoted to major pretty much right away. This was around the end of May or something when the decision was made. Darby goes and, 1942, correct. Darby goes and interviews a bunch of officers. And he selects, I think, 29 in total, all hand-picked officers with very completely oddball characters, some traditional, some were pilots, some were whatever, deacons, all this stuff. I mean, you name it, America's society is in there, at least at the time, right? And we have to remember it's an all-white unit also. But, so it's sometimes forgotten, but we should remember that. So he picks 29 guys, officers, who in turn interview volunteers. So there are about 2,000 or so volunteers who want to go out for this new dangerous unit kind of thing. They meet up in Carrickfergus, basically. It sort of becomes one of the centers of interviews, which has an old castle. It's just north of Belfast, and the U.S. Army is around Belfast, right? So they got like 30-some-odd thousand American troops there. 2,000 or so answer the call to volunteer for this new unit to be interviewed.
And how many were they actually looking for?
Darby,
if they have 2,000?
500. So eventually...
Oh, wow. Just 500. Okay.
So they whittle it down to 500. And basically, they're centered around Carrickfergus. There's an old British Army camp called Sunnylands, which today, by the way, holds a massive black rock dedicated to rangers that the city put up there. It's awesome. Oh, nice. It's like the mecca of any ranger. You should go to Northern Ireland, north of Belfast, to Carrickfergus and find the rock. Or any historian, really.
Yeah.
But in any event, so they whittled them down to 500 at Sunnylands in Carrickfergus. Where they also have a museum today, by the way. And they basically assemble the men, start some physical training, get gear, all this kind of stuff. After about a month or so, and getting some new people in and out because some people fall by the wayside, they take off to Scotland. And for British commando training in Achnacarry Castle, which is quite excellent, actually. And that's been the training depot for British commandos, where they then train for a month. And there are some real hardcore analysis by the British commander who's talking a little bit of smack about some of the Rangers, how lackluster they are and how terrible they are. But one of the Rangers drowns during training. And somehow I think that really sent a jolt through the rest of these Americans there. And they all of a sudden become really excellent, and they do a great job, and they become an awesome unit at the time. So they graduate something like, 450 or so guys after a month.
Because the training was pretty tough, right? I mean, can you talk about, some of the things that these guys had to do and why some people just said, oh, heck no, I'm done. I'm walking away. What were some of the training?
Yeah, the most notorious thing, and we still have this in the modern regiment, Ranger Regiment, and you have it in a lot of elite units, but let's focus on the World War II guys and its impact later on the regiment, was the speed march. So these guys, they don't have the rucks that we necessarily have in today's world, but back then they still had gear, and it did weigh a lot. Their rifles were heavier, so they'd have to do speed marches, and they would really smoke you, and they would weed out a lot of people, like they always say, the weak fall by the wayside, or the injured fall by the wayside. So the speed march was grueling. Every ranger that had gone through that training had written it down or told me or whatever, has been interviewed about how brutal these road marches were. I mean, really they call them speed marches, right? Of course.
So were they
the
timed?
idea was to go as fast as possible.
Yeah, like
they were timed, and they had X amount of miles, X amount of time, and all that kind of stuff. So they had that, but they had other things, water ops. They like traditional amphibious assaults, and those, of course, can be very dangerous in choppy water. They had obstacle courses, which to this day we use in the Ranger Regiment selection programs. They had log drills based on ancient Scottish games, where teams of Rangers had to lift logs and move them around and do exercises with them. They did bayonet courses. They did massive live fire exercises, which sometimes shot paddles out of the Rangers' hands. The British marksmen did. So everything was done under live fire conditions. Even when you crawled over a commando bridge or toggle ropes or whatever, they'd throw grenades at you. And the British commander, Charles Vaughan, wanted to really impress upon these Rangers. And he wanted to, about how important realistic training was to survive in combat, because he had been a raider with the British commandos in Nordic countries. So it was really hard training, live fire training. People got killed, people got wounded.
Wow.
I think only one Ranger died, and he drowned. It was a horrible death, actually. And the very same day, they still had to go and redo that mission that killed Hochtel, I think was his name. So this was really something I don't think any American had seen ever before. This live fire, rugged, brutal training, and it molded them into a pretty good unit actually at this point. And I think everybody was quite proud upon graduation.
Oh, I would imagine so. They've really accomplished a lot. And some of their training, a lot of their training, you mentioned like some bayonets, but unconventional warfare, right? So it was really, getting in there, fighting guys, hand-to-hand combat. That was a big part of it as well.
One of the, I think, hardest things when you read about it is how much they learned about sentry removal using this commando knife, the Fairbairn Sykes knife, and they actually would apply that in combat later on. They would actually creep up late at night and cut German or Italian or French sentries' throats or stab them in the kidney and stuff like that. I mean, it's brutal stuff. This is not for the faint-hearted by any means.
Yeah, because this is really the beginning.
It was unconventional warfare.
Right. This is the early beginning of what we know as special operations forces today.
Yes, I think in many ways that is true, although there are always discussions, and I know Darby himself always said, we're just really well-trained infantrymen.
Oh.
But, it was special, it was different, it was unique, and it was modeled after British commandos with an American taste, of course, eventually. And they decided, of course, to not name this new unit, Darby's Commandos, because it was a British term.
Right.
We're Americans and proud of it. And so Truscott, I guess there were some recommendations. Nobody really knows the exact origin per se. There are rumors, but ultimately Truscott said Rangers because that's an American known entity. And so they became known as the 1st Ranger Battalion.
Okay.
Or collectively Darby's Rangers.
Right. And now let's jump forward a little bit. They've been through this training. They've graduated. And the British have this new operation coming up to do a raid on the French coast at Dieppe. I think I'm pronouncing that that correct? Dieppe. The Dieppe raid. And I don't know if they asked or Darby volunteered them, but there were several of these Army Rangers who were working with the British and I think the Canadians on this raid. Can you talk about what their role was and what did they learn from this experience?
After they did their training at Achnacarry, they continued doing amphibious assaults, larger scale ones. And during that training, the British had decided to raid this town, like you said, Dieppe. But it got canceled originally. The original mission was canceled, and they had a bunch of Marines, believe it or not, attached to them, American Marines, to do this raid. So that raid got canceled, and because of this hype in this new Ranger unit, it was Rangers who then were tasked with joining this British-Canadian raid into this French town. And there were some real issues with it. About 10% of the Ranger Battalion went, roughly 50 guys.
Oh, okay. And
some of them trained quite a bit with the British commandos who were on the outermost perimeter of this raid. And they actually trained and they knew what to do. And those were about 40 guys under then Captain Murray. They sort of really knew what they were doing, what their job was, and all this kind of stuff, which was basically to join the British commandos and knock out some gun batteries that oversaw the landing beaches for the British Canadian troops. That was their job. And then there were other Rangers, 4 of whom were on the other side of the perimeter, who had very little training, but they had some with the British commandos. And then there was a handful of guys who were just thrown in with Canadian units, and they had no idea what they were doing. There was no training whatsoever. So it was like everything, the whole range. But the purpose, according to, because it was a primarily Canadian-led assault or raid, and it killed 60-70% or wounded, killed, captured 60-70% of each Canadian unit. I mean, it was a disaster. But based on Canadian historians who I respect very much, who had written, like I think a total of 4 books on Dieppe, the idea behind this raid really was for them to seize this new communication encrypted device the Germans had developed. That was basically the purpose of the raid.
Right.
For the Rangers, yes, kind of like exactly. And for the Rangers, the mission was really to be on the outermost edges of this raid, on the far left and the far right to knock out these gun batteries. And ultimately, they proved to be successful, but the overwhelming majority of Rangers don't even land.
Oh,
I think something like 10 or 12 Rangers land. I mean, it was hellacious. You know, it's just like incoming aircraft were strafing them. You know, when the ramps went down for the Canadians, they were just literally mowed down, and they landed on these shale beaches. There was no digging in, nothing. I mean, it was a slaughter.
Oh, wow.
But like I said, the Rangers on one section landed a handful of people. They were successful in their mission. On the other perimeters, the Rangers did a good job.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, this is Yellow Beach, where we had 40 Rangers, supposedly only a handful landed. And that's where also we took some early Ranger casualties. And then we had Orange Beach, which had some Rangers, you know, that had trained with the commandos. And they were not 100% successful, neither of these things, but successful enough to suppress gun battery fire onto these beaches. So they did their job.
Right. So Mir, the experience that they take back, how does that impact the Rangers?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting thing. In the general Allied scheme of things, people are making excuses and saying, we learned a lot for D-Day in 1944. I don't think that's true. I think the Allied planners learned a lot from subsequent amphibious assaults in North Africa, Sicily, Italy. That's what they learned for the big Normandy landing.
Okay.
For the Rangers, the interesting thing is when you read some of their accounts and letters and whatever, the guys who didn't go were pissed. They were so angry, and because they all wanted to go to war, and they're all like these lucky guys, you know, who got to go. And some of the guys who came back were devastated by it. Literally, like, I could not believe this hell. Gino Mercuriali actually wrote many years later, I didn't go watch Saving Private Ryan. Why would I? I have done that many times over, and it's a horrible thing. I don't want to see it. You know, so the learning experience for them was that they really needed to have proper intelligence, and I think they had it, but the mission was to seize this machine, so they didn't want to use naval bombardment and heavy airstrikes, you know, to blow the Germans up. So it was just bad luck. Everything was the worst thing that could happen happened, and I don't think through anybody's personal fault, really, or planning fault. It just was wrong time, wrong place.
Yeah.
And the Germans, some of them were alert, and it just was a nightmare scenario. The Rangers, I don't think fundamentally learned a lot. What I think Darby ultimately learned, though, was that you need good naval support, and you really need to know, you need to be assured that you can land your troops at the proper place with proper support. I think that's what his personal conclusions came from that, I think.
Yeah, he would have that opportunity because they're getting thrust into North Africa now, you know, Operation Torch. So what was the Ranger role in going into North Africa?
Yeah, first and foremost, it's an interesting thing because Darby's book, We Led the Way, is not considered to be too accurate. It's considered flamboyant and a bit over the top. But the very interesting thing is in that book is you really get to understand Darby a little bit better, and you know when they were tasked with seizing this port and again seizing these gun batteries, which becomes the theme for Ranger nighttime amphibious assaults, is to seize high points that have gun batteries overlooking the main landing beaches for the Allies. Darby is exceptionally nervous. They have trained. They really have done everything they could do with the Brits, learning how to do these assaults, refining things, learning how to knock out bunkers, you know, all that kind of stuff. They really have been training at this for months. And they go into North Africa, and the mission is at Port Azou to capture these two emplacements. One is basically in the harbor, and one is on a higher point. And Darby's actually quite nervous, you know, but he wants to make sure they have proper naval support, and he really is focused on that. And you know, alternative means of communication. So they have radios, they have signal flares, things like that. And they do. He divides it into two groups, a smaller one that goes into the harbor, and the one he leads, which goes around and does a nighttime march movement to seize this larger gun battery. And they all prove to be successful. And the interesting thing is, one or two of the boats, the landing crafts, actually dropped into the ocean accidentally, and dumped a lot of their radio gear.
Oh, wow.
So, not everything went well.
Yeah.
Phil Stern lost
And
a lot
it
of
never
camera
does.
equipment because he was in that.
Yeah.
Nothing ever goes. Right, first bullet and plans, it's all out the window.
Exactly.
But suffice it to say, Darby's planning is excellent. They've researched everything. They have exceptional intelligence, great photographs. They have plaster Paris, terrain models, all this stuff, and they do a great job. So Dammer, who was his executive officer and considered the tactical genius of Darby's Rangers, he goes into the harbor. They seize the guns there. Darby comes around and lands. They climb a little cliff. They do several kilometers, maybe 12 kilometers. I forget now what. Night march to the gun batteries, assault them, take them out. Hammer them with mortars. I mean, everything they had trained, they executed flawlessly. I mean, they seized everything, did their job. It was really incredible.
Yeah.
So they seized this thing, and nighttime amphibious assault, which is really their hallmark, what they've been trained for, to eliminate enemy obstacles. So they did that in Arzu, North Africa. And after that, there's a huge problem. I mean, Darby sends a company to reinforce. I think it's Terry Allen's Big Red One, who had some problems somewhere. And so the Rangers do small mop-up operations. But for a while, they become this dog and pony show to show higher how to do amphibious assaults. Yeah, and that's not going over well. So out of 500 guys, they lose about 100 or 110 guys for various infringements and or quitting. Or I want to even say there was some desertion here and there. But so they get 100 new guys in. They train them up to snuff, get them into the ranger mode of how to become a ranger, which is, of course, now with combat experience from Dieppe and at Arzu, that makes them very good trainers, and they really do a great job, still staying a very excellent special unit. And then they're tasked with Tunisia. The war's moving on in Africa and North Africa. And they're tasked with nighttime raids into the back of enemy-held positions, and they do a phenomenal job. So they basically do overland march into mountains, like 12 miles or 12 kilometers, I forget now what, with equipment tied down just like today, where, the modern ranger, you put on all your stuff, you jump up and down to make sure it doesn't make any noises. They perfected this kind of stuff. They perfected nighttime movement. They trained at night. They perfected, which is very challenging to move at night in enemy-held territory, and up and down mountains and trying to keep it really quiet. It's challenging, but they did so successfully, and they raid an Italian fortified position that the Allies really needed. And the Rangers, get there and continue observing it, and then assault this position, a bayonet charge basically. And Darby blows a bugle. Can you believe it? He's actually blowing a bugle. He was musically very inclined, by the way, actually. He had supposedly a great singing voice also. And so they come down, charge into it. The officers are leading the way with pistols and commando knives, stabbing, shooting people. Rangers are coming in with bayonets and small arms fire and some small mortars. And they seize this and they kill something like, I think out of 130, they probably killed and maimed, wounded like 120 guys, Italians, and captured 10 POWs as was their order. So they did not necessarily, they could have probably taken more prisoners, but they didn't. That's something to bear in mind. This was ugly, knife into your gut kind of stuff. And I also saw one of the officers who led this attack, I think it was Fox Company, Captain Murray. I met with his son, who, by the way, retired as an officer in Special Forces. And I saw his dad's commando knife in his office, and the tip had broken off. And we think that happened at this raid at Senet Station, where he drove it into an Italian and hit the bone, and it snapped. But anyway, so the Rangers do this mission. They do another similar mission to this called at El Guitar. And again, they demonstrate how superior they really are at night combat. and handling rugged mountainous terrain as well as landing on beaches. I mean, these guys are really an exceptional unit at this point, right? These guys are fantastic.
So through all of the North Africa, as you're saying, there's been a lot of successes and really proving their worth as a unit, as this new Ranger unit. So because of all these successes, that then led to the expansion of the Rangers, right? So can you briefly address how they expanded by the end of the North Africa campaign?
Originally being a provisional unit, think about it. Here they are now in combat, right? They have not been broken up. They've not been sent to other units to spread the joy. But instead, they've done such a remarkable job that, the Allies are now planning on seizing Sicily. Mm-hmm. And Sicily, they consider to be kind of like an aircraft carrier where they can, from there, they can bomb mainland Italy, drive up through the soft underbelly of Europe, which proves to be the exact opposite, because they're trying to relieve the pressure on the Soviets and all that kind of stuff. And so the Rangers have done remarkably well. They're exceptional nighttime fighters. So's the first, the Big Red One. We should give them credit. But the hires decide we need more of these kinds of units, and they love Darby. He proves to be an exceptional tactical commander. And so they decide to expand. In the meanwhile, some of the Rangers who had gotten injured or were no longer physically capable of doing the job had been shipped home to the U.S., and a couple of them actually ended up training the 2nd Ranger Battalion. I want to say Florida or Tennessee, I forget now which. But so that's interesting to me that you had a couple of Darby officers. I think one was Lieutenant Knudsen, had a problem with his feet, and he ended up training the Rangers that will ultimately end up in Normandy. But so the hire decide they need 3rd and 4th Ranger Battalion at this point, because the 2nd is being stood up in the U.S. And another point I want to make: the 1st Ranger Battalion is I think the only elite unit of the United States that has ever been formed outside of the United States. Oh. But in any event, so they decide to stand up more Rangers. So the Ranger officers and enlisted go out to, the replacement depots, get more volunteers, and they do. And so they run this is at Namur, Algeria, and they set up basically another, call it a Ranger training depot, and they run everybody through the paces. Darby divides this original Ranger battalion, they have 6 companies. So 2 companies are assigned per battalion. So he gets a good core of veterans into these new Ranger battalions. And he assigns people to take command of it that have been on his staff or were good officers. Roy Murray becomes the 4th Ranger Battalion commander. Hermann Dammer, German ancestry, is the 3rd Ranger Battalion commander. Darby, however, does not get to have a regimental headquarters because it's a provisional unit. The Allies decide he doesn't need a headquarters unit to handle all the battalions. So he still is the battalion commander for 1st Ranger Battalion, and he is basically the regimental commander for all 3 battalions. Right. So, but without official authorization. Anyway, they train all this up, and their mission is, and they have enough time to do this properly. Yeah. So they have a good unit. They have a good 1st, 3rd, and 4th. Spread throughout, all battalions are a core of 2 companies of veteran Rangers. Right. And their mission is to go and invade Sicily, and again to seize key ports. So
we're getting a little bit short on time. So I know they get into Sicily. And then after Sicily, they're with troops that move into Italy. I don't know if there's any quick anecdotes you have about that, but I really need to get into what happened at Anzio and Cisterna.
At Sicily, the Rangers are fantastic, do an awesome job, really great. They drive out the Germans, who they then will eventually face again in Italy, which is ironic. So the troops they had defeated in North Africa and in Sicily are the ones that are going to meet again, some of them, in Italy. They land in north of Salerno. They seize a high pass. The Allies get stuck. To beat these German mountainous defenses, the Allies decide they're going to bypass a couple of these big German defensive lines and land north of them at a place called Anzio.
Mm-hmm.
And then the idea was that from the south, the hard pressed Americans are going to push north while this new Allied army is going to land at Anzio, push south, and drive toward Rome, forcing the Germans to retreat.
Mm.
So we land there. This was the easiest landing for the Rangers. They take no casualties, unlike at Sicily, where the Rangers hit mines and really get a number of serious casualties. They had no problems landing at Anzio. They seized a sister town, which is like, a kilometer next to it, called Netuna.
Mm-hmm.
And for a week, the Allies are just basically hanging out there doing nothing while they're slowly and surely being bombarded by Germans who are rushing troops from all over Europe to contain this new Allied threat.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, the Allies decide, hey, we're going to push forward and we're going to expand our beachhead. And in order to do this, there'll be a general Allied advance. Mm-hmm. The Rangers will again be spearheading this into a rail highway hub of a town called Cisterna. Mm-hmm. And I've been to it several times, twice now, and I've actually walked the battlefield there. It's really interesting. So the Rangers are tasked with seizing this very important hub. This rail highway hub is very important. Mm-hmm. They really need to capture it. There's a general Allied advance at the same time. Mm-hmm. So the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions are sneaking up these ditches, and it's a flat, open, pool table-like terrain with dotted farmhouses, things like this. There is no cover here. The only way you can get into this is by using these ditches, and some of them are inches, and the others are a couple of feet. So you've got everything in there.
So they're
the 1st
exposed.
Ranger Battalion leads
they're fully
the way.
exposed, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So unless they manage to stay in ditches, and they do. Mm-hmm. So the 1st Battalion is tasked with going straight into Cisterna. The 3rd Ranger Battalion is right behind them, and its mission is to eliminate any German threat that might show up. Mm-hmm. So the 1st Battalion is not to engage in combat, but to push straight for Cisterna. 3rd Battalion is behind them, both going up these ditches. 3rd is following first, and 3rd is supposed to destroy any German positions that will be there. Italy had surrendered in the meanwhile, by the way. That's an important thing to know. So they're really facing mostly German, Polish, Baltic-type troops that have been integrated into the German army. 4th Ranger Battalion was held back by 2 hours to be the relief. So they were going to travel the single road up to Cisterna and come and reinforce in Cisterna once the Rangers had captured it. Of course, Allied intelligence was correct, but it was interpreted incorrectly. They said the German mainliner of resistance was beyond Cisterna, in the hills, not in front of Cisterna. And of course, it was in front of Cisterna. So the Rangers are starting to hear Germans. They're moving by Germans. They can hear commands being issued at night, things like that. There are vehicles up and down this road that they have to cross. And eventually, they remove a bunch of sentries, killing a number of them, but one of them yells out something, and it's pell-mell. The 1st Ranger Battalion runs into 100, 120 German troops, and they're just murdering them left, right, and sideways as they're pushing towards Cisterna. The 1st Battalion and 3rd Battalion are temporarily split, basically, because 3rd Ranger Battalion's battalion commander at the time, Alva Miller, and his command group got hit by a German tank. So the command structure of 3rd BAT was temporarily disabled. And then, of course, lower ranks rose to the occasion. 3rd Battalion eventually makes it, but right now they're stuck in this triangle of death. So the very top is Cisterna. To the right is a road. To the left is a road. Behind them are ditches and, tracks. And they're stuck in this 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 yard triangle of death. And they're being hit with everything German, and the difficulty for the Rangers is their limited ammunition. Nobody on the Allied line has even managed to advance as far as 1st and 3rd BAT has. 4th Ranger Battalion manages maybe 800 meters, and they're hammered. They're taking serious casualties. So 1st and 3rd have a perimeter. The German tanks and armored vehicles fire up all their ammo, retreat, refuel, rearm, come back, do that. Rangers are wiping out hand-to-hand combat tanks, armored vehicles, taking on, hardcore German Hermann Goering and German airborne troops, some of whom they had fought earlier. And Darby can't push through.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, they didn't have good radio communications. They could not call in naval gunfire. The Allied line is pummeled. The Germans had planned a counterattack the next day, actually. So the Rangers run smack into these units that were intended to push the Allies out of Anzio. So the Rangers basically killed tons of Germans, but eventually are forced to surrender as they're running out of ammunition. And the 2 battalions are wiped out, and 4th Ranger Battalion is locked in and still in combat, as is there are the rest of the Allied lines. But the Rangers basically get captured. 1st and 3rd basically get wiped out, and hundreds of them surrender and are marched by the Germans at the Roman Colosseum for propaganda purposes. And then we, of course, have some great escape stories after that. And 4th Ranger Battalion, of course, keeps fighting for a while and all that, but eventually are sent home. With the guys who've had plenty of time in combat. So
the Rangers at this point, after the devastation there in Cisterna, the Rangers are basically soon after that disbanded in Italy. But what happened to Darby? Where did he end up?
Well, Darby, after crying, of course, and breaking down when he realized what had happened, was eventually assigned to the 179th. Infantry regiment, and then also eventually gets sent back to D.C. To be part of general staff over there, where he gave some lectures. And then from there, he was reassigned to take over the 10th Mountain Division when their commanding general got wounded. And Darby is out on a reconnaissance mission with his staff, planning an attack up north of Milan. To drive out the rest of the German opposition, which is, of course, has melted over the months. It has withdrawn and all that stuff, and we're pummeling them. But he gets killed, and another one of his guys gets killed too by tiny shrapnel from some German artillery. I think in '88, maybe, I don't remember exactly, but they were just exposed, overlooking the defenses, German defenses, and they got hit. And he gets killed, and 2 days later, the Germans surrender in Italy. So really, really sad thing. And that was April 30th.
April 30th, 45.
1944.
45,
yes.
For the rest of the Rangers, we talked about those who were in captivity. They didn't let the fact of being in captivity stop them from fighting and escaping and continuing the fight. So briefly, we've just got a couple of minutes left. Give me some examples of what some of these guys did and how they earned the name the Houdini Club. Yeah.
So eventually, typical Ranger fashion, and some of the hardened old guys and some of the guys who've been trained very well, they're like, we're not just going to, be shipped off to Germany where ugly things will happen to us as well. Some of them managed to escape immediately from temporary Italian POW camps, manned by Germans and by Italian fascists, even though Italy had surrendered. Some of them just literally walk out the wire and pretend to be Italian workers, then join partisans and fight behind enemy lines and killing Germans before they rejoin the Allies. Wow. We have a guy called Schunstrom who did that for 6 months, I think. He was one of the first escapees out of an Italian POW camp. And he joins partisans, kills Germans, and eventually walks straight back into an Allied line while being shot at by Germans. Others dug holes through windows in boxcars and trains. They were being shipped north to German POW camps. And you can imagine going to Germany, that makes escaping even harder. So there are some guys who manage to, dig holes into the planks or dig a hole through the windows and jump off the trains as they slowed or as they started to leave train stations. And some of them would be recaptured. Others would escape. Some of them would basically murder local Italians after they raided their stuff because they didn't want to, they couldn't trust people. But so you'd had also guys who would not just escape from from Italian POW camps, but they'd escape from trains that were being used to ship them to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had some guys who had the worst experiences you could imagine, like Holocaust concentration camp scenarios.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Two of them would eventually escape and travel throughout Russia, Crimea, Ukraine, and spending months on the road, like losing half their body weight. And one guy was recaptured 3 times and had his teeth knocked in, and was on a burial detail at a concentration camp or working camp, whatever it was called, where Soviet prisoners were held, who were starved to death, basically. And every day he would have a push cart and he'd dump 10 to 20 dead Soviets, who were not all dead, by the way, into this gravel pit, and he'd on occasion see Soviets still being alive, and they were being buried alive.
Yeah.
And one other memorable moment he had is, other than getting his teeth kicked in, is when he saw some Soviet prisoners luring this German shepherd close to them, and then they just ripped that animal apart and ate the meat raw. That's how dire the situation was. And he eventually escapes through Soviet lines, and those are the guys who became known as the Houdini Club.
Yeah.
And one of these guys who had this worst experience basically said, "I always felt it was my duty to escape."
Oh yeah, exactly, and that's what they teach us in the Army, and
exactly.
And one of the other advantages to doing all this is they help tie up some of the German forces behind the lines. To keep them from going to the front lines as well.
Absolutely. They expended a lot of, can you imagine? There are guys who were escaping, trying to make their way out of Germany north to, the Nordic countries, and they would sabotage, everything. And that would, of course, force the Germans to come and withdraw troops from the Eastern Front, where they were being hard pressed, and now they're being pressed on the Western Front. So, that really did cause them some problems, so for sure. The Houdini Club. Yeah,
the Houdini Club, right, which is the name of your book. So, but your book it doesn't just cover these things. It covers, the whole story of Darby's Rangers throughout World War II. But Mir, before we close, it's just time for our segment called Hua Trivia. So is there some piece of Army trivia you can share about Darby's Rangers?
Sure, I can throw 2 things at you. One is, and I'm not certain if 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions did this, but the 1st Ranger Battalion boys started this trend in cutting their leggings down to about 10 inches. And I forget now how long they were, 12 to 14 maybe, something like that, the leggings, because the leggings would rub into their calves during these hellacious speed marches. So they'd cut them down so they wouldn't rub their calf muscles sore or raw. So that'd be one. And the guy who invented or who won the competition, the prize of designing the scroll that the regiment today still wears, was Master Sergeant or Sergeant at the time, I think, Anthony Rada from Flint, Michigan.
Oh.
He designed it, and, we have the black, red, and white Ranger scroll that the regiment to this day still has. So that's some Hua trivia for you.
Oh, that's great. Good. Well, thank you so much, Mir, for all of your insights today about Darby's Rangers and their impact on operations throughout World War II. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Army Rangers during World War II, or find out more about Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, X, and Instagram. And of course, we mentioned Mir's book, The Houdini Club, which should be available for any place that you buy books. So, Mir, thank you again so much for helping us out today. And thanks to all of you listening here on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. And for the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.